I have been involved in nonviolent direct action campaigns, civil resistance, creative actions of all kinds, since about 1980. I started in the environmental movement, in particular in the anti-nuclear weapons area, and that transitioned really quickly into looking at why someone would spend, or why governments would spend so much money on weapons of mass destruction rather than on people and people's needs. So it transitioned very quickly into a complete social justice perspective. And so that's still what I do. So I like to think about creative resistance or artistic resistance in the broadest possible spectrum. So it's not just what you identify immediately as a beautiful painting or a perfect theater piece, but also in how you do your direct action work, how you make your phone calls, how you do fake news reports, right? There's this huge piece. And that makes this medium incredibly subversive and incredibly powerful. And it's not that authorities have not recognized this. You know, even in Shakespeare's time, just prior to Shakespeare, England outlawed theater for several hundred years because it's so subversive, and it can be used to tell a story that the authorities in power do not want to have out there. And you see repetitions of this in many cultures throughout history, that different kinds of artistic expression has been censored significantly because, like humor, it evokes emotional truths that people can no longer ignore, and it moves people to action in a way that's particularly empowering and builds a community of support within that expressiveness. So that's also a critical piece of my resistance training and resistance work. And I work right now with some very small children, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And they understand very elementally that you can't do it alone, right? And that you can learn new skills, particularly if you're in a group. And doing mass art projects, whether it is, a street theater protest or a mass demonstration or a mural or singing in a choral group, actually builds the ability to work as a team and to function in a support network, which is critical for long-term and sustainable campaigns. So of course, you can think about the singing revolution, which is a mass cultural response to Soviet occupation in Estonia, right? So you could start with that kind of example. You can also start with a small example of Gandhi incorporating cultural resistance and the reclaiming of traditional cloth making or salt making within the broader campaign for independence. We could look at Tiananmen Square, actually, and we could look at the students there who, while they were in Tiananmen Square, actually erected what they considered a replica of our Statue of Liberty. It wasn't exactly the same statue, and they call her the goddess of democracy, but it was a very similar structure that they built there to encapsulate their visions and their view for a future that included something that they would know as democracy. The early days, the medieval days in Europe, where there were performing troupes of clowns, or commedia dell'arte, where there were jesters making fun of existing conditions. This is very basic human response to injustices and inequality, and they were used all over the world. And there's all kinds of theater in different parts of Asia and Southeast Asia that also incorporate these themes that cannot be talked about openly in the society, but can be portrayed in the theater work and the puppetry that's done. So, lots of people talk about direct action or creative resistance or resistance in general, and some people will recognize that it is both an art and a science. And I consider the spectrum of direct action and campaigning to be sort of broader than the more traditional Sharpian definitions of protest, non-cooperation, intervention, in that there are other categories. And just over this weekend, I've always had 4 categories, the 4th one being the constructive category, where you're actually putting in place the future you want, you're building the windmills, you're creating the alternative governance institutions. And there's a really important 5th category that James Lawson helped me identify this weekend, which is the work of building a movement. And that too requires creative input. So whether you're training or whether you're actually on the street trying to portray the message, what you want to do is involve people's experience. And rather than using the educational the old style educational framework of banking your knowledge, where one person stands in the front of the room and deposits their knowledge into the people who are watching. You use the popular education methodologies, or Auguste Boal, who worked in this realm, the theater of the oppressed methodologies, where there are no spectators. There are just actors. Everyone is involved in contributing to the outcome. And this part of the work is the art of the work. So incorporating what you can from everybody's experiences. And so in the trainings that I do, like in the configurations of the actions, you're doing role plays, you're doing creative work, maybe it's improvisational things, you're trying out different techniques, so you can actually incorporate our experiences and come up with a better and more inclusive solution. So in the bigger sense of the fifth category is like building the movement. So it's not just mobilizing people, but it's building capacity, giving the people tools that they need. And it starts off very mundanely, perhaps, where you actually think, well, my early experiences, for example, were on the Hudson River with Pete Seeger and an organization called the Clearwater. And where he started, which was brilliant, really, was that here was this river that was polluted, and a beautiful river. He knew that if people came down to the river and had a celebratory event there, they would want to clean it up. And so they started holding festivals on the river. Actually, it was dinners, potlucks, with music and food. And so this brought in a cultural aspects and celebratory aspects, and really sparked the people's interest in cleaning the river up and doing advocacy and education to support that. That's a core principle of organizing, I believe, to make the whole thing validate people's experiences, provide things that are fun and interesting and good food, and to ask people to participate where they're comfortable. So people could come by bringing a covered dish, a small offering, and by themselves they might not actually care if they clean the river up, they might not want to stick their head out, but they could come down and bring some potatoes. And that's really an easy way to enter into the conversation about how do we work together, how do we build a group and change our future and reclaim what's ours. So on that level, that's a very small aspect of how to think about organizing. And in this day and age of the internet, we do have this crisis, I believe, in that we rely on non-personal forms of communication, and I think it's hurting our movement. And in a lot of ways, discussions I have with fellow compatriot organizers, we have to go back to the phone calls and the actual human contact that will enable people to commit and turn out.